On June 14th, 2018, 22-year-old Haley Ford and 21-year-old Claire Martin flew from Seattle to Anchorage, the capital of Alaska. Both were students at the University of Washington, studying ecology, and had been enthusiastic hikers since their youth. Over the past 3 years, they had completed dozens of routes through the national parks of Washington, Oregon, and California. Alaska was their dream. Wild nature, bears, eagles, endless forests, and mountains where one can spend days without encountering a single person. They planned a one-week hike in Tugak National Park, one of the largest parks in the United States. Almost 1 million acres of untouched nature, mountains, glaciers, rivers, dense spruce, and large forests. The park is known for its surreal character and unpredictability. The weather can change within hours. Grizzly bears are encountered regularly. Trails are often washed out by rain or covered with fallen trees. Tourists must be experienced and well prepared and have equipment to survive under extreme conditions. Haley and Claire were prepared. The equipment lists they showed their friends before departure included a four-season tent, sleeping bags with a temperature rating of down to -10 degrees Celsius, a camping stove, a supply of food for 10 days, a first aid kit, bear spray, signal flares, a Garmin GPS navigation device with pre-installed maps of the park, and a portable solar-powered charger. Both were in good physical condition, jogged regularly, and climbed. Parents and friends were not worried. The girls knew what they were doing. On June 15th, they checked in at the entrance of Jugak Park and filled out the route form. They planned to hike the Black Ridge Trail, about 50 miles with overnight stays at 5 locations. The goal was the summit of Wolverine Mountain, from where there is a view of Anchorage and Cook Inlet. Their return was planned for June 22nd. The ranger at the entrance, a man around 50 years old named Dan, later told investigators that the girls appeared confident and cheerful. He gave them the usual recommendations: to store food in bear containers, not to be out at night without flashlights, and to report any problems via satellite phone. They did not have a satellite phone, only GPS devices and mobile phones that worked only in areas with cell coverage. Dan advised them to rent a satellite phone, but they declined and said they would stick to the hiking trails, where there was occasional reception. The first 3 days went according to plan. Haley and Claire sent text messages to their friends and parents every evening when they stopped for the night. They attached photos. The girls against the backdrop of mountains, by streams in the forest, smiling, happy. On the evening of June 17th, Claire sent a final message to her sister Emma. The text was short: on the summit. Almost no reception. We're setting up camp by the stream. See you in a week. A photo was attached, a panorama from the summit, green valleys below, snow-covered peaks in the distance. Time sent: 9:40 p.m. After that, the connection was lost. On June 18th, 19, and 20, there were no messages. The parents began to worry, but did not panic yet. They thought the girls simply had no network coverage, that they were deep in the park, far from cell towers. On June 22nd, when the girls were supposed to return, they were not there. The parents called the park office. Dan, the ranger at the entrance, checked the records. Haley and Claire had not checked out when leaving the park. He tried to contact them via the GPS coordinates they had left on the route form, but the GPS trackers were turned off or were not transmitting a signal. On June 23rd, the search and rescue operation began. A team of 8 rangers and 10 volunteer hikers set out along the Black Ridge Trail and followed the plan the girls had left behind. The weather was changeable: rain, fog, and at times clearing skies. Visibility was poor. The trails were muddy and slippery. The group covered the first half of the route in 2 days and checked every campsite and every stopping point where the girls might have set up camp. They found traces of their presence: fire pits, trampled grass, wrappers from energy bars, but no sign of the girls themselves. On the 4th day of the search, in June, the group reached the summit of Wolverine. From here, Claire had sent her last message. They examined the surroundings and descended to a stream in the valley below the summit. They found traces of a camp: trampled grass, stones piled into a circle for a campfire, but no campfire, no tents, no equipment, no personal belongings, as if the girls had stopped here, then gathered themselves and left without leaving anything behind. The search group expanded the search radius. They checked side trails, bushes, ravines, and stream banks. They deployed tracking dogs that had been brought by helicopter from Anchorage. The dogs picked up the scent from the girls' clothing, which had been provided by the parents, and attempted to follow the route. The dogs led the group from the summit down to the stream and then into the forest on the eastern slope. The trail ended in a dense spruce forest. The dogs began to run in circles and whine. They could not determine a direction. The handler said that this behavior occurs when the scent has been washed away by water or when something has happened that drastically changed the situation. The victims were lifted and carried away, loaded into a car, even though there could be no cars in this area, as there were no roads there. The search lasted 2 weeks. The number of participants increased to 40 people. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras and drones with cameras were used. Hundreds of square miles were searched. Every cave, every ravine, every place where the girls could have fallen, become trapped, or taken shelter from the weather was checked. Nothing. Haley Ford and Claire Martin had vanished without a trace. On July 9th, the search was officially called off. The coordinator of the operation held a press conference and stated that the team had searched the entire area within a 20-mile radius of the girls' last known location and had used all available resources, but had not found them. The case was classified as a missing persons case in the wilderness. It was assumed that the girls might have gotten lost, strayed from the route, and fallen into a hard-to-reach place where their bodies were not found, or that they might have been victims of a bear attack. Grizzlies regularly occur in the park, and there had already been cases of fatal attacks. The bodies could have been eaten or dragged into a cave. The parents refused to accept that their daughters were dead. They organized their own search, hired private investigators, and offered a reward of $000. They put up posters in Anchorage, published appeals on social networks, and gave interviews on local television stations. Months passed without news. On September 12, 2018, 3 months after their disappearance, two tourists from Canada, a man and a woman in their 30s, were hiking on a little-known path in the eastern part of the Tugak, about 15 miles from Halley's and Clem's last known location. The path was not marked on official maps. It was an old, overgrown, and rarely used hunting trail. They navigated using their GPS device and were looking for a secluded place to set up their camp. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the woman noticed a smell. It was a strong, disgusting smell of decomposition. She thought it was a dead animal, an elk or a deer that had been killed by a predator. They went a few meters farther. The smell grew stronger. The man suggested leaving the path to check what was there. Maybe there was something interesting for a photo. The woman did not want to, but agreed. They moved about 30 meters off the path and fought their way through bushes and low spruce branches. They came to a small clearing surrounded by trees, and then they saw it. Tied to a thick spruce tree, standing in the middle of the clearing, were two naked human figures. Both were women, both standing with their backs to the tree trunk, facing different directions, their hands bound behind their backs and tied around the trunk. Their feet were also bound with ropes that were fastened to the roots of the tree. The bodies were in a terrible condition, dried out, partially mummified by the dry air and cold of Alaska, partially torn apart by wild animals. The skin was dark brown and stretched tightly over the bones. The eyes and soft tissue had been eaten by birds or small predators. The hair had remained intact, long, dark on one, light on the other. The bodies were completely naked, without clothing. The poses were horrifying, as if they had been deliberately put on display demonstratively. The Canadian tourists stood there in shock and were unable to move for several seconds. The woman screamed, turned away, and began to cry. The man took out his phone and called emergency services, even though there was no cell reception there. He tried to photograph the site, but his hands were shaking. They returned to the path and hurried to the nearest point where there was reception, about 5 miles away. They arrived there in the evening and called the Alaska State Police. A group of investigators and forensic technicians arrived at the scene the next morning by helicopter. They cordoned off the area and began a thorough investigation. The bodies were carefully cut free from the ropes and placed in bags to be transported to the morgue. The ropes and straps with which the victims had been bound were collected as evidence. They photographed every inch of the clearing and searched for footprints, shoe prints, hair, fibers, and other clues. The bodies were taken to the morgue in Anchorage. The medical examiner performed an autopsy. Identification was difficult. The bodies were severely damaged, the faces barely recognizable. DNA samples were taken and compared with samples from Haley and Claire. The match was unequivocal. It was them. The investigation revealed the following. Both victims died from asphyxiation, most likely by strangulation with a rope or with hands. Marks were visible on the necks, deep grooves characteristic of strangulation with a cord. Death occurred approximately 2 to 3 months before discovery, which corresponded to the time of disappearance, but there were additional injuries. In Claire's case, a fracture of the base of the skull was found, a linear fracture running through the occipital bone. Such an injury is caused by a strong blow to the back of the head with a blunt object. The injury was sustained before death, as there were signs of bleeding around the fracture, which means that the heart was still beating when it occurred. Burn marks were found on Haley's body, not from fire, but from a chemical. Small areas of skin on the abdomen, thighs, and arms were burned. In some places the skin was missing, exposing the subcutaneous tissue. The experts suspected that it could have been an acid or an alkali, but without an analysis of the chemical residues this cannot be stated with certainty. These burns were also inflicted before death. Multiple rib fractures were found in both victims. In Haley, 5 ribs on the left side were broken. In Claire, 4 on the right side. The fractures were fresh and had occurred shortly before death. Such fractures can result from blows with fists, feet, a stick, or from strong pressure on the chest. An important detail: there were no signs of sexual violence. Examination of the pelvic organs and analyses revealed no traces of sperm or injuries typical of rape. This ruled out one of the common theories in cases involving the abduction of women. The bodies were emaciated, muscle mass was significantly reduced. There were signs of muscle atrophy typical of prolonged starvation or lack of movement. The expert estimated that the victims had spent at least 2 to 3 weeks under conditions of inadequate nutrition and possibly restricted movement before their deaths. This meant that they were held captive, possibly bound or confined somewhere, and fed minimally or not at all. Analysis of the stomach contents revealed remains of plant matter, berries, possibly roots, grass. Nothing cooked, no traces of the normal food they had taken with them on the hike. It was as if they had been forced to eat what they could find in the forest, or were given nothing to eat at all, and tried to survive by eating whatever they could find. The forensic technicians worked at the discovery site for 3 days. The clearing was examined carefully. No shoe prints of the killer were found. The ground beneath the trees was covered with a thick layer of needles and moss, which leaves no impressions. The ropes with which the victims had been bound were sent for examination. One of the ropes was a hiking strap, similar to those used to secure equipment to backpacks. The second was an ordinary household cord made of polypropylene, available in any store. The third was a piece of paracord, a braided cord used by the military and by hikers. Different types, different origins, as if the killer had taken whatever was at hand. No fingerprints were found on the ropes. Either the killer was working with gloves, or time and weather had destroyed the traces. DNA analysis of the ropes showed that they contained the DNA of Haley and Claire, but no music, foreign samples. The killer was careful. The girl's clothing had completely disappeared. Nowhere in the clearing or within a radius of 100 meters around it was a piece of fabric, shoes, or anything else found. The only things that were found were 2 pairs of sneakers, neatly placed next to the tree to which the bodies were tied. The sneakers were clean, laced, and positioned parallel to each other. This looked demonstrative, like part of a ritual or a message. 300 meters from the clearing in an easterly direction, investigators discovered an old hunting cabin, a small building about 3 by 4 meters in size, made of wood, with a corrugated metal roof and a door on hinges without a lock. Inside it was empty, bare walls, an earthen floor, an old fire pit in the corner, a shelf with a few rusty cans, no signs of recent presence. The dust on the floor was thick. No one had been here for months, perhaps even years. The forensic technicians examined the cabin anyway, took dust samples, and checked the walls and floor for blood or biological traces. They found nothing. But the fact that the cabin was so close to the crime scene gave cause for thought. Perhaps the killer had used it as a temporary shelter, held the girls there, then killed them and tied them to a tree. But why did the cabin look untouched? Perhaps he had carefully removed all traces, swept the floor, removed fingerprints, or he had used another place and the cabin was merely a coincidence. The investigators began to develop theories. It was obvious that this was a murder, planned and brutal. Someone had abducted the girls, held them captive for several weeks, tortured them. Beatings, chemical burns, starvation. Then strangled them and put their bodies on display by tying them to a tree in a pose that appeared ritualistic or demonstrative. The motive: it was not sexual. There was no sexual violence. It was also not a robbery. The girls' equipment and valuables were gone, but the murder was too complex for a simple robbery. What remains is the version of murder for the sake of murder itself, for pleasure, for control, to satisfy the psychological needs of a serial killer or a psychopath. Who could have done this? The investigators started with the locals. Within a radius of 50 miles around Chugach Park live about 2,000 people, most of them in small settlements, on farms, and in remote houses. Many of them are hunters, fishermen, and recluses who prefer to live far from civilization. Among them could be people with criminal pasts, psychological problems, or aggressive tendencies. The police compiled a list of suspects. All men aged 20 to 60 who lived in the area, had access to the park, and were familiar with the area were checked. Particular attention was paid to those with prior convictions for violent, sexual, or assault-related offenses. 3 individuals stood out as the most likely suspects. The first was Alaskan, 53 years old, a former ranger in Chugach Park. He worked there from 2001 until he was dismissed for an assault on tourists. The official reason for his dismissal was abuse of authority and aggressive behavior. The details of the case: Lewis caught a group of tourists who were making a campfire in a prohibited area, lunged at one of them, struck him several times with his fists, and broke his nose. The tourists filed a complaint. Lewis was fired. He avoided criminal prosecution thanks to compensation paid to the victim. After his dismissal, Lewis lived alone in a small cabin 30 miles from the park, hunted, and occasionally worked as a guide for hunters. His neighbors described him as withdrawn, sullen, sometimes aggressive, especially when drunk. The police knew him. They had arrested him several times for fights in a local bar and once for threats against a neighbor across the property line, but he had no prior convictions for serious crimes. The second suspect is Jonathan Green, 38 years old, a former soldier, served in the Marines, and took part in operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. He returned to Alaska in 2010 with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. He lived in a trailer 40 miles from the park, worked as a casual laborer, and suffered from alcoholism. It was known that he had outbursts of anger and that the police had come to him several times following calls from neighbors who heard shouting and sounds of fighting. Once, Jonathan threatened his ex-girlfriend with a knife, but she did not file a report. The third suspect was Walter Sims, 61 years old, a longtime resident of the area who had been living in a forest 20 miles from the park for 40 years. He is a hunter, trapper, and almost a complete recluse. He rarely appears in the village, buys supplies once a month, and spends the rest of the time in the forest. Neighbors said, he's strange, avoids people, and sometimes talks to himself. One woman said she had seen animal skins hanging on the walls in his house, which looked eerie. However, Walter had no criminal record and had never been arrested. All three were summoned for questioning. Lewis came with a lawyer, behaved calmly, and answered the questions monosyllabically. He was asked where he had been in June 2018. He said he had been at home alone, without witnesses. Had he been working in the park at that time? No. He had been fired 4 years earlier and no longer had access. Did he know about the missing girls? Yes. He had seen the news but had not been interested. The investigators asked for permission to search his house and his car. Lewis agreed and had no objections. The search of the house revealed nothing. An ordinary country house, old furniture, hunting rifles on the wall, deer and bear skins, the usual equipment of a hunter. In the garage stood an old Ford pickup, dirty, with hunting gear. The vehicle was examined for traces of blood and biological material. Dirt samples were taken from the wheels and fibers from the seats. Nothing suspicious. The DNA of Haley or Claire was not found. Jonathan Green was more nervous. He fidgeted, sweated, and avoided eye contact. He was asked where he had been in June. He said he had been working at a construction site in Anchorage and living there in a worker's dormitory. We checked this. His alibi was partially confirmed. His employer said Jonathan had indeed worked from May to July, but there were days when he did not show up and said he was sick. Could those days coincide with the days of the girl's abduction? Possibly. We asked him to provide a DNA sample for comparison. Jonathan reluctantly agreed. The result came 2 weeks later. The DNA did not match any of those found at the crime scene. Walter Sims did not appear for the summons. The police drove to his house. The house was deep in the forest. It was reached by a dirt road and then required walking another half-mile. It was an old log cabin with a moss-covered roof, surrounded by trash, old traps, and animal skins hanging on ropes between the trees to dry. Walter greeted them on the porch with a rifle in his hand. Not aggressively. He was just holding it. He asked what they wanted. The investigators explained that they wanted to ask him some questions about the missing girls. Walter said he knew nothing, did not go into the park, and did not see tourists. They asked him to come inside the house. Walter refused and said that without a search warrant, he would not let them in. The investigators had no search warrant. There was no sufficient basis for one. They asked Walter to come to the police station to be formally questioned. He refused and said he was busy, had broken no laws, and they should leave him alone. The investigators left but kept Walter under observation. They organized covert surveillance of his house and checked whether he met anyone anywhere. Walter led a normal life. He went hunting, fishing, and once a month drove to town to buy supplies. Nothing suspicious. 1 month later, they obtained a search warrant for Walter's house, based on indirect suspicions and his refusal to cooperate. They arrived with a group of 6 people, including forensic technicians. This time, Walter did not resist and opened the house. Inside there was chaos. Old furniture, books, animal skins on the walls and on the floor, the smell of dog and smoke. We searched every corner. We found a collection of knives, machetes, and traps. But all of this is normal for a hunter. We examined the blood. It was all animal blood from deer and elk. No traces of human blood. No hair from Haley or Claire. Nothing that would connect Walter to the crime. We searched the basement and the attic. The basement was empty, with an earthen floor and a few boxes of supplies. The attic was crammed with old things, boxes, old clothes, and tools. The forensic technicians took soil samples from the ground and examined them for biological traces. Nothing. Walter was released, but remained on the list of suspects. None of the 3 was completely ruled out, but there was also no evidence against them. The investigators expanded their search. They reviewed footage from highway cameras leading to the park for June 2018. They looked for suspicious vehicles that could have transported the abducted girls. They found hundreds of cars and checked each one by license plate. Nothing concrete. They interviewed tourists who had been in the park at the same time as Haley and Claire. Some were found through the registration records at the park entrance. Everyone said they did not see the girls, did not hear any screams or sounds of a struggle. Music, noticed nothing suspicious. The version that the girls had been held captive for several weeks meant that there had to be a place where they were hidden. Music, a cabin in the forest was one possibility, but it appeared untouched. The investigators searched music for other possible locations, abandoned buildings, caves, old mines, bunkers. In the area around the park, there were several abandoned mines from the gold rush era, all of which were checked. Nothing. The case was at a dead end. There were a few leads, suspects, but no evidence. An analysis of the killer's behavior by an FBI profiler yielded the following. The perpetrator is most likely a man between 30 and 50 years old, a loner who is familiar with the area and with survival in the wilderness. He may have military or hunting experience, and music, knows how to leave no traces. Psychologically, he is a sadist who takes pleasure in controlling and inflicting pain. Displaying the bodies indicates a desire to shock, to send a message, and possibly to enjoy society's reaction to his work. The motive is unclear. It may be territorial behavior. The killer views the park as his territory and kills those who intrude into it. Perhaps it is a ritual or a fantasy he is trying to realize. Perhaps it is simply the pleasure of killing. The profiler predicted that this could be a serial killer who might repeat his crime. One should be prepared for new victims. But from September 2018 to the present day, no new missing persons cases similar to that of Haley and Claire have been recorded in Tugak Park. The girls' parents are devastated. Haley and Claire were buried in Seattle, next to each other, just as they had been friends in life. Haley's mother never recovered from the loss, fell into depression, and died a year later of a heart attack. Claire's father continues to demand justice, writes letters to the police, the FBI, and Congress, and insists that the investigation be reopened and the killer found. The case remains open. From time to time, investigators review the evidence and pursue new leads, if any appear. There have been several anonymous calls reporting suspicious individuals near the park. Each time the information was checked, but nothing was found. In 2020, one of the detectives who had worked on the case retired. In a farewell interview with a local newspaper, he said that the case of Haley Ford and Claire Martin Music was the most horrific and mysterious of his career. He believes that the killer is still somewhere nearby, possibly living a normal life, working, interacting with people, and no one suspects what he has done, or that he lives isolated in the forest, avoids people, and waits for the next opportunity. The detective said he cannot sleep peacefully knowing that the killer is still at large and that there are families somewhere waiting for answers they may never receive. Chugach Park remains a popular destination for tourists. Thousands of people visit it every year to enjoy the nature, the mountains, and the forests. Most do not know the story of Haley and Claire. Those who do know it try to hike in groups, not to stray from the trails, and to be cautious. A memorial plaque was installed on the Black Ridge Trail in memory of the girls. It reads, "In memory of Haley Ford and Claire Martin, who loved these mountains. Go safely. Come home." But the questions remain. Who killed them? Why so cruelly? Where is he now? And will he do it again? The investigators do not know the answers. There is little evidence. Time passes, witnesses' memories fade. The case may remain unsolved forever. Another tragedy in the long list of unsolved murders in the wild nature of America. But somewhere out there, in the forests of Alaska, there may be a man who knows the truth, who remembers the faces of Haley and Claire, their screams, their fear, who knows why he did it, and what he felt when he tied their bodies to a tree, neatly placed their shoes beside them, walked away, and left them to the ravages of time and animals. He knows it, and as long as he remains silent, the truth remains hidden deep in the forest, in the darkness between the trees, where no light reaches and where justice does not reach.